Durant and Draymond a couple of weeks ago did an interview together. Draymond conducted it. And basically it was the both of them in a room kind of like rehashing their issues, while they were teammates with the Warriors. Obviously it's well documented that they fought during a particular game against the Clippers. And things were basically pointed to that event. And basically at that, like when they fought, it was basically like media started speculating at that point that Kevin Durant was going to leave the Warriors, and he eventually did that offseason for the Nets. So basically that was brought back to life when Draymond Green asked and posed the question of like what really went down during that fight. Kevin Durant and Draymond were very honest, first of all, two people who are very honest in the media, which, I mean, they're both like journalists' dreams in a lot of the sense, because, you're giving journalists sound bites to post on Twitter and send to the fans who had a frenzy with it. And basically, they both talked about how they thought the Warriors front office and the coaching staff handled it poorly, and how it was, blah, blah, blah. And it was basically like turned into this whole thing where the Warriors front office and management looked horrible. Which, yeah, I mean, I'm not the biggest fan of the front office, as many people know. And the coaching staff is a little suspect to, I did like Steve Kerr, but this season, it was a little, but that's all about basketball. We're talking about sports media. So how did this interview like change the landscape of sports media? Are we going to see more stuff of players just having like one-on-one conversations with each other? I've noticed this trend of like players basically going and kind of putting their own truth out on the internet. It's not necessarily that they're, putting out like or they're waiting for some journalist to be a middleman to put out an interview, but they're putting out content themselves. I mean, look at Instagram lives, like Deebo Samuel, for example, who's a wide receiver on the Niners this offseason, would basically just like have other players go on his Instagram live and not interview them, but they would have like casual conversations in a very casual setting, and it would deliver quotes. It's turning, sports media is kind of turning into something that I feel like the players are trying to monopolize. I mean, not monopolize, but I mean, you look at Naomi Osaka and all the complaints, or not the complaints, but all of the things that she said about the press, and how like press conferences cause her anxiety. And you have to think about that eventually. I feel like with this upcoming generation of athletes who were raised in a society where mental health is prioritized, you're going to start to see maybe less and less of this, like, 30 reporters on one athlete type scenario, and more so of these intimate one-on-one conversations with athlete on athlete, where I feel like it's a win-win for journalists too, because journalists aren't necessarily getting the best responses from these press conferences. Yeah, you'll get a gold nugget once in a while, but are you getting the best content from these press conferences when you have press conferences with athletes? Oftentimes they're pre-prepared answers. It's like, oh, the opponents we're playing are tough. They fly around the field. They tackle hard, they play hard, and they compete till the last second. Like, that's some fucking bullshit that you hear everywhere. Like, it's a canned response, but like you saw but if you guys haven't seen it, go watch the interview. But Kevin Durant and Draymond, it was so unfiltered. It was so real. And it was because of the fact that they're teammates, that they have familiarity with each other, that they can relate to one another because they're both athletes that played for the same team. Like that got the quotes out there. That got the relatability out there. You see Kevin Durant in a press conference would have never said half that shit. That's what I'm trying to say is the sports media landscape changing in that are we going to see more of these one-on-one player interviews? Because that's been cool. You started to see it a little bit now too, even with like the way that kind of like journalists are starting YouTube channels. I mean, like this, that whole idea of like just constantly putting out content on like every little thing is definitely like changing the landscape. I feel like the old sports media, which is, I mean, kind of the book that I'm reading right now, kind of talks about like columnists and how, it was, you had to wait till the next day to hear like the reaction of journalists, right? So you had to wait till the Chronicle came to your door before you could read Lowell Cohn's column about the Giants or about the Warriors or whatever, right? Now everything is instantaneous. You go on Twitter during the middle of the first quarter of a football game, like you have 800 different takes on what happened on one play. That is ridiculous. That is crazy because that's technology. And I feel like we almost are seeing media change with the technology that is being presented. I mean, look at Grant and what he's doing with his YouTube channel. I mean, it's literally every single piece of like every single angle that you could possibly take with the Niners headline, Grant has tried, right? And he's examining it through different lenses by bringing on different guests that may have different viewpoints. And I think that is where the future of sports media is, not necessarily these columns and opinions and writing. I mean, newspapers are dying. Like that's been clear. So, it's pretty cool. So my main points were, are we going to see kind of more of these one-on-one player interactions? YouTube could totally be the future for sports journalists. I mean, just look at what some of the Niner beat writers are doing. And I just go to Niner Twitter as an example of that because I feel like they kind of are the future of where we see sports journalism heading. I'm not familiar with other NFL fan bases. They could be doing this as well, but yeah. And I mean, the other thing I wanted to talk about is bias is going to exist no matter what. I mean, no matter who the journalist is, like bias will semi-exist. That's what got me thinking is like, is there a real truth when it comes to anything? Not even necessarily sports media, but I mean, regular media. Is there a fundamental truth? I feel like in a lot of cases there isn't. Particularly, I mean, you look at sports, a lot of it is left up to interpretation for journalists to craft narratives to feed to the fans. I feel like every fan has their own unique take. I feel like every journalist has a unique take based on biases, based on facts that they hear. All of these things, they shape our worldview. So that's been interesting, is like sports media is definitely changing. And I feel like you get hella different narratives now because you have so many people who have access to one another, right? I feel like access in terms of like, people of higher social platforms and people of lower social platforms, like that gap is dwindling because of social media. But at the same time, like access is also getting harder because I feel like people are kind of sticking to their clique a little bit more, particularly in the sports world. I feel like and with COVID and everything, like journalists can't get into the locker rooms anymore, so it's tough. So I feel like access to athletes is becoming a little harder. You don't see much of these one-on-one interviews, right? Like before, we used to see hella one-on-one interviews with like, Rachel Nichols and so-and-so athlete. I know Rachel Nichols is like, canceled or whatever, but you get my point. I mean, you're seeing less and less of these journalists like interview athletes now, and it's more so like athletes on athletes. And I feel like that's where it's trending. And it's going to be interesting to see kind of where the landscape shifts. And I feel like we're seeing a shift due to COVID, partially of the sports media kind of shift, which is really cool. And I enjoy it because I actually really like watching the media as well for sports. I feel like that's a really interesting topic that no one really talks about. So